Everyone has their AI awakening or holy shit moment. It was just sort of unlocked for me. There's such a tendency to pull to the extremes. Reserve the assumptions that we're making about the long-term implications of the technology so that we can actually be intimate with, actually be present with the experience of how it's affecting our lives and our careers on a day-to-day basis. We live in an age of what the World Health Organization calls a polycrisis. There's planetary uncertainty, there's economic uncertainty, there's political uncertainty. It's the uncertainty that gives our life texture and meaning. If you want to, say, change the world, it's better if the future is not already fixed. That's what gives you the ability to do so.
Simone Stolzoff, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Simone, I want to start with a confession.
Please.
So, so Simone and I, for those of you who don't know, went to high school together. I'm a little bit older than you are, but we overlapped and it's a tiny school. And when you published your book, The Good Enough Job, which I have right here, you started popping up on my LinkedIn feed. And I was originally a little bit reluctant. I own a recruiting agency, and part of what I do, in addition to just placing people at these cool startups, is helping my candidates figure out what type of work is going to be fulfilling and exciting, and what types of roles or companies aren't going to make them anxious or, make them dread getting out of bed in the morning. So when I heard your thesis around not necessarily having to find that dream job, I kind of paused in my boots for a minute. So just wanted to put that out there, and I'd love to give you the floor for a minute. And for folks that are listening who don't know you and haven't read your book, haven't seen your TED Talk, which is fantastic, by the way. Yeah, Dan loves it too. How would you describe what you're trying to say in your book?
To start, I'll say that you're very far from alone, Sarah. I think just looking at the title of the book alone, The Good Enough Job, Reclaiming Life from Work, you might think it's this like slacker manifesto or this book that's very sort of anti-work and just an excuse to sit on our couches more. And I think the argument itself is a bit more nuanced. So essentially, the case that I'm making is that when we think about work-life balance, we often think about how we spend our time, how we allocate our days. And the argument is that if we want to develop a healthier relationship to work, we have to go deeper. And rather than just thinking about how we spend our time, we have to think about how we construct our identities. And so the book is a case for diversifying our identities, much like an investor benefits from diversifying the sources of stocks in their portfolio. We too benefit from diversifying the sources of meaning and identity in our lives. Now, this isn't to say that work can't be a source of identity or can't be a source of meaning or purpose, but it's problematic or becomes dangerous when work is the sole source of meaning, identity, and purpose in our lives. And so to your candidates or your clients or maybe people on this call who are looking for meaning through their work, I don't think that's a problem in and of itself, but I am trying to encourage people to think more broadly about how they define success, about how they construct who they are. And ultimately, I think it ultimately leads to better work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, before I found a job that I'm good at and I like doing and that brings me some value, man, I hated work. And it was hard for me. I was embarrassed to talk about work. And so it was this like part of my life that I was losing, when in reality, I just needed to separate my self-worth from work. But that's so hard when you're 23 and you got no clue what's going on in the world. So generative AI is changing how we think, work, interact. How do you see it making an impact? Good, bad, indifferent?
Yeah, I think everyone sort of has their AI awakening or sort of their holy shit moment where they realize the implications of this new technology.
When was yours?
Yeah, I was actually writing an op-ed for the New York Times, and I had sent in my draft. I thought I was all done. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was on the way to the airport for a bachelor party. And I got an email from my editor, and she says, the piece is looking great. There's just this one metaphor that I think isn't quite working. And I hadn't really dove too deeply into ChatGPT or some of the other LLMs, and I brought up my phone, opened the app, and said, "What are 10 other metaphors similar to this metaphor?" And I'm kind of adding myself. I don't know if this is within the Times editorial guidelines, but I, picked one off the list, made a small like tweak to it, sent it back to the editor, and that Monday it was in print in the Times. And I think it was this realization that, like, not that it can be this total shortcut to replace all types of work for me, but for so long as a writer, as a creative, I was so resistant to even exploring what the technology could
Mhm.
offer. And it was this sort of unlock moment for me where I was like, oh, maybe this could actually help in my workflow, actually help in my
Yeah.
process.
Where does it show up in your workflow?
Yeah, so for me, I try and have all of my first drafts, sort of like the initial clay of anything I'm writing, come from me. I think some people really use AI a lot for the research phase or for the outlining. And for me, it's been most helpful as what I call like a developmental editor. So once I have a piece of writing, basically using it as an editor, asking it questions about the piece, asking it to point out potential blind spots or inconsistencies in my logic, and especially with something that's a book-length manuscript, something that's 60,000 words, it's incredibly good at being able to synthesize and condense all that information and see the project from a high level. And so,
Oh.
for
Mhm.
example, like in my latest book, it's about uncertainty and how to get better at dealing with what we don't know. I wrote the whole first draft by myself. I sent it into my editor, got edits from her. And then as I was working through sort of the second, the third drafts of the book, that's when I really used AI a little bit more in my editing process. So I'd ask it questions like, where do I have an echo of a given word multiple times in a short span of writing? Or what is something that I might be leaving out of this chapter or this section that would help me connect better with a reader? And so it was sort of my zoomed out perspective that helped me get a idea of what I might be missing when I was sort of too close to the work itself.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that too. I mean, I remember writing an English paper. It was like you always want to get the draft out a couple of days before
Mm.
because you want to have some distance from it.
Mm.
And there are all these tricks. Like sometimes I would read my work backwards because it's easier to pick out grammatical mistakes.
Mhm.
But yeah, I love that as a way to pull back and to see it more holistically.
Yeah, I think that especially with writers, using it at the very early stages of a project can be a slippery slope because ultimately at the end of the day, these LLMs, they're averagers, right? They'll find sort of the probabilistic expectation of what would come next based on what came before. And that leads to a lot of sort of milquetoast writing that is just
Mhm.
trying to like be the lowest common denominator. And so I often think about like what gives you taste or what gives you voice or style as a writer is the basically the AI rejections that you have, like the things where you say no to Grammarly or no to spell check or no to the first version that ChatGPT spits out. But I do think that as an editor or a way to push and sharpen what you already have is a really nice use case. So if you are able to generate and create the clay, it can help you sculpt that clay into something that is more polished.
Who have you worked with to help hone in your view of how to use generative AI in your flow or as a thought partner? Did this just happen naturally? You're like, oh, I think this is the right way to do it. Or did you communicate with people? How did you come to this realization that this is the best way for you to use it?
A lot has just been trial and error. I think I'm part of some author communities and group chats, and there's a lot of anxiety around AI, especially for
Mhm.
nonfiction writing and the things that might be replaced by these large language models. But in practice, most of what I've learned has just been for trying different things and seeing what might work best for me. One clear distinction that I think is important to make is the best way for a writing piece to turn out well when it is AI influenced is to have a sense of taste, have a sense of what good writing is. And so, of course, for like a high school student or maybe a college student, it can generate a passable paper or maybe a paper that will like adhere to a rubric that a professor has for a class. But as a professional writer, someone who is making a living both on sort of the originality of my arguments and the quality of the prose itself, it's really important for me to keep honing my taste of what good writing means. And that makes it easier for me to, say, sift through 10 different variations for what an AI might give me for a headline for a piece. Or it might help me understand when it's time to reject the AI suggestion in favor of my own.
Yeah. When we were talking to our guest, Tiago, Sarah was going through this example of how she uses it to help her figure out which candidates she should be moving through the funnel. And it works because she knows it inside and out.
Mhm.
She'd be doing that anyways, very successfully. If it wasn't for AI, it's helping, it's creating velocity, it's making the mundane a little bit easier. But I think it's a really salient point. Like, it's not a cheat code, it's not an
Yeah.
easy button.
And for me, it's almost like I'll have these mental blocks where I can't think of the right word, or I can't think of how to describe something.
Mhm.
And so if I have the transcript from the candidate and I'm doing the summary, like I, I can just tweak it a bit, but it like gets me part of the way there. I want to shift for a minute and ask you about this new book.
Mm.
Remind me of the title.
It's called How to Not Know.
How to Not Know. And it's all about uncertainty, right? And I feel like that's at the crux of what is so terrifying right now with AI. Everything is changing so quickly,
Mm.
and we have no idea how to even prepare ourselves. So I'd love to hear from you how you thought of the topic for the book, and if you could just kind of explain what it's about.
Yeah. So maybe similar to my first book, I wrote this book about renegotiating our relationship to work, and it was sort of catapulted into relevance during the pandemic as so many people were rethinking their relationship to work. And I started writing this book in about 2023, and it seems like it's coming out at, just the right time as people are navigating uncertainty in their professional lives and their personal lives. We live in an age of what the World Health Organization calls a polycrisis. So there's sort of planetary uncertainty, there's economic uncertainty, there's political uncertainty. And the argument of the book is that when we are certain, when we feel like we know exactly what the future holds, or we feel like we know exactly who someone is based on their political beliefs, or exactly how an emerging technology might impact our careers or our businesses, it closes our minds. We presume that we know exactly the way things are going to go. But if we're able to maintain a state of not knowing, if we're able to develop comfort with uncertainty, we can, for example, look at people as individuals as opposed to archetypes. We can run experiments to see how a technology like AI might actually impact our business. We can reserve the right to not judge a event in our future until it actually comes to pass. Um, there's like a little parable that I tell in the book about a Chinese farmer that I think is very relevant to this age of AI. And basically, the farmer has a horse, and the horse runs away, and all of his neighbors come to his door and say, "Oh, we're so sorry to hear about your horse. What a tragedy." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And then the next day, the horse comes back, and with it, there are 7 wild horses that it brings with it. And all the neighbors come to his door and say, "Oh, what luck! You have all these new horses." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And then the day after that, the farmer's son is taking one of the wild horses out for a ride and falls and breaks his leg. And the neighbors come by and say, "Oh, what a bummer. We're so sorry to hear about your son." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the day after that, a general from the Chinese military comes to the town to conscript people into the army. And because the son has broken his leg, he's able to avoid the draft. And you know where this is going. The farmer says,
Yeah.
"Maybe yes, maybe no." I think it's relevant to this current technological age we're in because there's such a tendency to pull to the extremes, to either, lionize AI and say, this is this revolution and it's going to lead to this unprecedented level of productivity in this golden age where people are going to automate all of their rote tasks and just focus on higher level work, or to villainize AI and say, this is going to automate so many people's professions and there's going to be class warfare and we're not going to know what to do when all of the jobs are gone. And, my advice, and I think, the broader argument of the book says, let's reserve the assumptions that we're making about the long-term implications of the technology so that we can actually be intimate with, actually be present with the experience of how it's affecting our lives and our careers on a day-to-day basis. So that's the book. It's an argument for increasing our uncertainty tolerance so that we might be able to gracefully adapt to whatever the future may bring.
It's so interesting because I've been in tech most of my professional career. You have as well. And the only constant is change.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's like, oh, okay, it's more change. Great. We can adapt to that. We can move quickly. But there's so many people out there who it's like, I've been a project manager for a construction company for 45 years. That's my wheelhouse. And I get a little bit more money each year and I complete these projects. And all of a sudden, I'm either able to do 50% more because I can use generative AI to check on a change order or whatever, or I'm going to get automated out because I'm 55, 60, and as end of my career, and some young kid is using Gen AI. So, I mean, there are two completely different extremes, but it sounds like it's just kind of sitting with the uncertainty, leaning into being okay with not knowing the future.
Yeah. And I want to also go back to something that you said about being present. And this thought came up for me as well when I was listening to your TED talk, and you give examples of things that people can do to, you know, create an identity that is beyond just work. And one of the examples that you gave is like turn your phone on airplane mode and be present with your kids, which is so relevant for us with young kids. And I feel like anxiety, it always comes from thinking about the past or the future, right? Like I said all these things to this person and do they hate me now? Like, should I not have said that? Or did I sound stupid? Or all these things that could happen that could go wrong in the future, which like it's heard my sister say once, like, it's never the thing that you think is going to go wrong. Something else will go wrong, but it's not the thing that you're worried about. So like, why bother? And you have a young son as well. It's such a blessing to be a parent. And everybody always says time goes by so fast, and it's so true. And so you have to be so present. And maybe that's a way that we can approach AI too, of like, okay, I'm here in this moment. And when I have, panic attacks or whatever, it's like, okay, I am safe. I am safe right here. Physically, nothing is hurting me. It's the same with AI. I have this computer in front of me. And I always like to say, like, encourage people to play. Part of the reason why we started this podcast is to help bring people along with this AI revolution, because it's like there's nothing it's not going back in its box. Like it's here. And so like how can we encourage people to play with it and have an open mind, because there are so many ways to use it to be more creative or build a product, even if you don't know how to code. And I feel like I'm rambling here and I don't have a question, but
Well, I think you're onto something, which is that action can be a great antidote to anxiety. And so it's not just being sort of complacent and saying, I can't control any of this. Let's like let this technological wave wash over me. It's thinking about what is in your realm of control or in your realm of influence. And I think this experimental mindset or this ability to sort of build to learn is one of the most adaptive skills in this AI era. And so often I think about sort of like a decision tree. And the first question is, if you're feeling anxious, like what is in your power to control versus what is not in your power to control. And so first kind of separating those two categories, and then from what is in your realm of control, asking how you might be able to take action to address some things that you're worried about. When it comes to AI, there's ways in which we can take action to learn about these tools. And so they feel less of this sort of like ambiguous threat out there. And then there are things that you can't control. And then your job is to really just, regulate your nervous system to be able to do what you need to do to be able to keep moving. I think there's a subtle distinction between complacency and just saying, okay, like this wave is coming, I can't do anything, versus like taking active steps to be able to find a sense of agency amidst all that's changing.
Yeah. I've heard so many studies, I'm not going to quote any of them, but the general consensus is that like only 5 or 10% of Americans are the type that take control of their future.
Hmm.
The rest are more comfortable in the status quo to let things just happen to them. You've done way more research on this. I'm curious to get your thoughts on like where you see, I guess, the gaps in how people are thinking about change, how people are approaching it. Maybe we can take the specific lens of work and how work is going to change.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think this really goes back to whether you feel like you are sort of a victim of your experience or whether you are sort of a protagonist in your own life. I think about this framework often that comes from Dan Pink, who's a fellow nonfiction author. And he says that the source of intrinsic motivation, when we're motivated by things internally, there are three primary drivers. One is a feeling of mastery, so feeling like you're learning what you hope to be learning. The second is a feeling of purpose, feeling like what you're doing is contributing to something larger than yourself. And the third is a feeling of autonomy, so feeling like you are in the driver's seat of your own life. And I think that same framework can be used to apply to, say, a career evaluation as well. So if you're feeling unfulfilled in your job, you might ask yourself, like, are you learning the things that you hope to be learning? Are you on the path towards a mastery that is personally resonant for you? Are you in touch with some sort of purpose that's larger than yourself? Like, are you connected to either the mission of the organization that you're working for or the ways in which this job allows you to have the type of impact that you hope to have? And lastly, how much autonomy do you have? Do you feel empowered to be able to, say, do your work in the way that you want to? I think that's kind of a nice way to think about the difference between what we can control and what we can't control. And I think that autonomy is not just something that employees have to cultivate from within, but I think the best employers, the best managers are cultivating that in their teams as well. I actually think that's sort of like the biggest lesson from the pandemic in my mind is the best employee perk is not, a free lunch or a ping pong table. It's the sense of empowerment that you get when your boss trusts you to be able to do work when and how you see fit. And I think a lot of our working world still has a lot of holdovers from a more industrial age where, say, there was a more direct relationship between how much time we put in and the outputs that we get. But in a knowledge economy, that isn't necessarily the case, especially if you're doing some sort of generative or creative work, say coming up with a headline for a marketing campaign or writing a strategic document for the future of an organization or something like writing a book. It requires time and space to think. And there isn't always a direct relationship between, say, the number of hours that you put in and the quality of the output. And so the companies understand that, these old proxies, like the number of hours you spend in your desk chair, might not actually be the best proxies for the quality of the output, I really think have a leg up in this economy. And when employees feel like they're empowered to do work when and how they see fit, they are much more bought in and less likely to churn as well.
Totally. I love the autonomy feeling. I work at a generative AI company, and the ability to just like find information quickly. I don't have to rely on my peers necessarily. I can get things done. I can use generative AI as that, not that creator, but that like a thought partner. I can bounce ideas off of it. I can ask it for feedback on what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, what can I be doing better. And so I think the autonomy thing is what I love about my current role. I guess my question to you is like, how do you see people capturing that? Is it just a cultural thing or is it a technology thing? Is it just for knowledge workers?
Yeah, I think you can break it down a few different ways. Part of it is just about time. I think something that you alluded to earlier is we all carry around these offices in our pockets, and they have the potential to make work expand like a gas and fill all of our unoccupied space. As, parents, that the sort of fixed 9 to 5 schedule doesn't really work for all people and all lifestyles. And so one
Yeah,
way
like,
that
oh no, the kid's sick. Like, what am I just gonna let my kid stay at school sick? No, I'm gonna cancel my meetings and change my entire day.
Totally.
Like,
Yeah. And I think that like one level of autonomy is just, being able to organize or direct your schedule in a way that allows you to not only produce your best work, but also maintain your life outside of work as well. And so in my first book, there's this distinction I make between integrators and segmenters. It's these two sort of styles that people like to work. And integrators don't mind a more fluid boundary between when you're working and when you're not working, whereas segmenters prefer to have, harder boundaries and harder lines. And so it really is a nice way to think sort of awareness wise about what it is that you prefer from your work life. Are you someone that wants to show up at the office at 9 and leave at 5 and leave your work laptop there? Or are you someone that wants to do some work in the morning and then maybe go for a run in the middle of the day and then do a little bit of work and then pick your kids up from school and then sign back on at 8 o'clock after dinner? These aren't necessarily better or worse ways, but they are stylistic choices that it's really important for your team, your boss, your manager, or even for yourself to know. And
Yeah.
so, what you were saying, Daniel, about the autonomy that generative AI can engender in workers, I think is absolutely true. It has lowered the barrier to make things tangible. So, for example, in the design world, I used to work at this company called IDEO, and we had this mantra that you should never show up to a meeting without a prototype. Rather than just talking about what you hope to build, you should sort of build it first, and then you can show people and give them something to react to. And that's never been easier in this current age, where you don't necessarily need to be a engineer to create a software prototype or a designer to make something look passable. And I think that's incredibly empowering. And so I think the question that is left is sort of, what is the role for collaboration? What is the role for, human to human interaction? And I think some companies are definitely getting that question answered better than others.
I want to talk a little bit about the switch to self-employment. And you talk a little bit about this in your first book, because I work for myself. I have since 2019, and I can't imagine any other way. But a lot of my friends are like, how do you block off your time or know what you spend your time doing? And for me, just to give a little bit of context, it was almost a forcing function. My anxiety and depression was so bad that I had to be able to take care of myself and my schedule. And so for me, being beholden to an employer who could fire me at any time and then be like, oh, my resume is too jumpy, who's ever going to hire me again? Like that anxiety and like, what does my manager think of me? Like those things were driving me into the ground. And so for me, even though my income is incredibly inconsistent and I never know where my next dollar is going to come from, it's so liberating in a way that I need it to be, and where I can be productive in my windows when I'm feeling the most productive. And I try not to let myself feel bad if I'm tired and I go take a nap. So I think that this is something that a lot more people are going to have to wrestle with and make that transition, because
A lot of them are getting laid off.
a lot of them are
First of
getting,
all,
yeah, and the gig economy is, I think, going to come back even stronger. So I want to put it back on you, Simone, because you used to work for other people and now you don't. What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, on one hand, I do, agree with what both of you were saying, which is that as lifelong careers and stable employment become less and less easy to find, it is actually incredibly stable or empowering to be able to build skills or build a portfolio or build the ability to have a type of work life that no employer or market or bad boss has the power to take away from you. Um, but I also think that there are trade-offs on either side of the coin. I think we live in a world where it's really easy to valorize the sort of entrepreneurial journey or solopreneurship or side grinds and freelance work and self-employment. And I think there are some aspects of it that have been incredibly productive in terms of, for example, my ability to have control over my own schedule, my ability to work on projects that I choose, and the sort of feeling of earning money myself versus getting paid by an employer. But there are also downsides to it. One is that I miss being part of a team or having the sort of like collaborative culture of a company. There are aspects of rising and falling based on my own professional accomplishments that I times feels incredibly empowering and at times feels like a lot of pressure. And I think the same is true for more traditional corporate employment. There are downsides of sitting in meetings that should have been emails, or dealing with corporate politics and bureaucracy, or potentially working on projects that don't actually align with your interests. But there are also benefits of having money show up in your bank account every 2 weeks and having built-in collaborators that are working towards a shared goal and a shared mission. And I actually think that in some ways the pendulum has swung in the other direction. And now full-time employment is a bit underrated as everyone is sort of showing off their side businesses on Instagram and TikTok and waxing poetic by how incredible it is to be your own boss. I think it's sort of different strokes for different folks. And also it really depends on what season you are in your own life. So one small example is that when I left the corporate world, I was like, oh, I'm so excited to be my own boss and not overwork. And then I, started working for myself and learned that I was the worst boss that I ever had. I was pushed to sort of work all the time, open my laptop on the weekends, have no boundaries between my work and my life. And I had to learn that it was incumbent on myself to erect those types of boundaries to make sure that I was having some balance in my life. There's this op-ed from the New York Times I think about all the time about why you'll marry the wrong person. And the argument is essentially, rather than just thinking about all the ways that someone is great, we should actually be thinking about all the ways in which, they might be crazy, or they might be, not perfect. And that will be a illuminating way to see whose problems you'd be willing to deal with. And the same is true with our work life. So instead of just thinking about sort of the highest highs of these different potential pathless paths, trying to figure out what it is that we might be willing to bear. What type of suck are we willing to put up with? And that might be a nice way to think about your career.
Yeah. Shit flows downhill. So if you work in an organization and you're in the bottom, like you get cut and it's hard and you don't have control. So yeah, you've got control of your life, but like being your own boss, man, that's got to be such a hard transition. I'm really curious, when you become an entrepreneur, how do you find your own tribe?
Hmm.
I know you said you have a group of people that you chat with on a regular basis. How do you find them? Where are they? How does this evolve? Is that part of your regular strategy? Is how can I build up my network of coaches and mentors and friends and colleagues?
Yeah, I think for one, you have to have an understanding that if you're struggling with certain problems, there's probably other people that are struggling with those same problems. And so I think there's two main methods to find community. One is to sort of seek out pre-existing communities, and the other is to build it yourself. So maybe finding existing communities means going to conferences or putting yourself out there on these digital platforms. And some of it is using your own network or asking your friends or your colleagues, like, do you know anyone else that is also trying to make it in the way that I am? And one thing I found is that, people tend to be incredibly generous. The infrastructure doesn't exist in the same way that it does at a company where you can just sort of look for the Slack channel for fellow dog lovers or whatever. You have to sort of take those proactive steps to find it yourself. And so like right now, I am an author, and so there are little communities that I've built around being an author. I am a speaker, so I have like communities that I've built with fellow speakers. I'm a teacher, and similarly, there are communities I've found of fellow teachers, and I'm a journalist. And so thinking about those concentric circles of different parts of your identity or different parts of your professional life and trying to find others is a difficult part, but also a really rewarding part of being self-employed or being out on your own.
Yeah. You mentioned in your TED Talk, you have a group that you play basketball with.
Mhm.
And they don't care what you do for work. They care that you show up on time and you're a good teammate. I play men's league hockey and it's the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have no clue how much most of the people make on my team.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what half of them even do for work. We don't talk about that stuff at all. And it is this unbelievable reset. And it's this 90 minutes once a week where I go into this different mode, this different part of my life.
Mhm.
And being a solopreneur, entrepreneur, it's got to be hard because, like you said, when you first started working 24/7, but having those times, what a way to protect your mental sanity.
Yeah. Well, I want to make the distinction. I think there are two different types of communities. So, like the ones that you were talking about around teachers and journalists and entrepreneurs, that's very much tied to work. Whereas the basketball example and the hockey example is very much what you advocate for in finding something that is completely separate. And I love it, like my little like light bulb went off when I was reading this in the book, and I think you said this in your TED Talk too, of doing something just to do it,
Mhm.
not as a means to an end. Like it's so tempting to like remember for Maddie's birthday party, her second birthday party, I went all out
We
on
spent 3 months
it
creating the
was
decorations.
it was like a monsters theme. I had like a huge celly, I had doors hanging, I had the scare totals and the scare of the month and
Everyone's
all
jaw dropped when I
it,
walked in. It was like,
yeah, I made Boo's door, and then like I can't tell you how many people came up to me and they're like, "You should start a business
Hmm.
doing this for people." And I was like, "I you couldn't pay me enough. Like this was so much work, and like I'd rather just make money like the way that I make it." But it was that it kind of fed the creative need in me. But I don't think in our society we do enough of that, and we're trained at a very young age. You have to get the best grades, you have to have all these things for your college application, and there's always something more to strive for. And once you get into the college, then it's get the best job so that you can then move up the ladder, and it's always doing something for something else, and
Mhm.
it's never just sitting, being present, and like having a conversation with you and learning and
well, I think for listeners, I think the cool thing about this is, our main thesis is generative AI is going to unlock our potential. It opens up our ability to do more things that we want,
Mm.
that we find value in outside of our work. And I love that. It's like, we're not doing this as a means to an end. We're doing this because, man, we only have so much time on this earth.
right.
Like, what are we doing here if we hate our lives from 9 to 5? And yeah, I just think I'm just excited for the stories we hear. And I guess in your research, thinking about work and uncertainty, I'm curious if there's any interesting takeaways from different groups or different cohorts of people around how work is changing.
Mm. Yeah, so the form of both of my books are that each chapter is sort of a mini case study. So looking at someone and their relationship to work in the first book, and looking at someone and their relationship to uncertainty in the second book. So in the uncertainty book, I look at things like imposter syndrome and self-doubt, and then in our interpersonal lives, like how do you make decisions with someone else about, say, whether to get divorced or whether to move, and then looking at it in our organizations and our businesses, how do you create room for dissent and be able to disagree productively, and then ultimately existentially. So how do you think about these huge uncertainties in our life, like AI, but also climate change or the fact that we're going to die, our own mortality? So I can fly at each of these different altitudes and thinking about what some of these communities have taught me. But I think the sort of overarching message is that often we're so uncomfortable with uncertainty because it feels bad, right? Like if you know what the future holds, then it's really easy to plan and predict. But if you don't know, then you have to deal with the sort of fear and anxiety that comes with it. But in actuality, first you can sort of think about the alternative. So what if our life had no uncertainty in it? What if we were just sort of on a conveyor belt headed towards a known destination? No movie wouldn't have a spoiler, no first date would ever have the butterflies of maybe so. It's the uncertainty that gives our life texture and meaning and serendipity and surprise. And I think that can be incredibly empowering for people when they realize that if you want to, say, change the world, it's better if the future is not already fixed. That's what gives you the ability to do so. No sort of life-changing discovery in science or really groundbreaking piece of art or revolutionary company has come to being without someone's ability to sort of get to the frontier, to get to the point where they didn't know exactly where they were going and continuing to push forward nonetheless. And so maybe that's the one thing that I'd hope someone takes away from our conversation is to keep going. There's this metaphor that I learned when I was at IDEO, which is that being an innovator is sort of like rowing a boat on a lake that's shrouded in heavy fog. You can't see exactly where you're going. You don't know exactly where you'll end up, But you have two jobs. One is to maintain the faith that you'll eventually reach land. You're in a lake after all. And the second is to keep rowing, right? To not stop moving forward. And I think that's the sort of lesson that I hope people take away from both the book and this conversation is that, one of the best antidotes to the fear and the anxiety that we feel around uncertainty is action and continuing to move forward. And I think that's the thing that some of these generative AI tools allow us to do is to sort of take action in our own lives.
Yeah, I wrote that down earlier, the action bias. You've given us some great ideas already of like where to start and how to think about using generative AI. But if you could leave the listeners with one clear example of how you're using it, how a peer is using it, but what can they do right now after this episode that can potentially give them that spark, that unlock that you've experienced, that we've experienced?
Well, one of the things I like to say is that when we're certain about some aspects of our life or our careers, it makes it easier to hold uncertainty in other aspects. And so the push is sort of to find your anchors, find the things that will remain constant amidst all the winds that are changing. And I think that's one thing that a tool like a large language model can be really good at is helping you define your values and define what are the things that are the through lines in your career or in your life that you want to maintain moving forward. So maybe in your personal life, that just sort of defining for yourself what you are about, what it is that you care about, what is your sort of personal vision and mission as if you were the CEO of your company of one. And I think that's a really nice use case for generative AI to be able to feed it with your thoughts and maybe some of your writing and some of your beliefs and help define that for yourself so it can be an anchor amidst all that is changing ahead.
That's so powerful. I mean, I wish when I was in college I had this because I felt so lost as to what I could do, like what value I could bring. And I was afraid to talk to people about it to my total detriment. And especially for people changing roles, changing careers, getting laid off. Well, it's a great time to reflect. So I appreciate that. I love it.
Simone, thank you so much. It is so good to see you after all of these years.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Simone.
Thanks for listening to Promptly Speaking. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, writing a review, sharing it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss out on new episodes. And we want to hear from you. Send your questions, comments, and favorite AI use cases to hello@promptlyspeakingpod.com. See you next week.